So originally, before I was a PE teacher, I was in the Navy. So I was in the Navy for a while, and then I had two passions in life. So engineering is what I did in the Navy, and my other passion was physical activity and sport. This is all about who's changing who. So I'm going to kind of talk to you about, so I set out, as many of you did, as a aspiring teacher to try and change as many people as possible and influence as many young people's lives around my topic, which was trying to promote physical activity for life and a love of sport and physical activity. What I wasn't prepared for is how they would change me in the process, and this is illogical, but actually we don't often take the time to reflect how they've changed us and how those key critical incidents change our practice or thoughts. So I'll talk to you about the first kind of changes. The first one was a professionalisation process. So we all know that we get indoctrined into the system. So things like pedagogical architectures, so slotting into a department, and we often say we adopt a pedagogy of necessity. We just adapt our practice to survive. And so this is what kind of happened to me. I got landed in, and I adapted I almost, not totally abandoned, but tried to morph myself into the current culture that I was in. So my practice changed radically. So I started to really think about my A-level and my GCSE classes and my attainment, and my master's was all around trying to promote people progress through the zone of proximal development. So I was really geared around academic performance and sporting performance. So I had teams that were competing at national level, netball. We were beating private schools, which is always great to do. But then I had a key moment where I met Zoe, and Zoe was a year 7 who came into my class, and whilst I had one eye on improving academic attainment and sporting performance, actually there were a whole cohort of individuals that I really needed to help and support. And if I asked you what your PE experiences were like at school, you'll probably have that dichotomy. There'll be some that absolutely loved it and some that loathed it. And I just said this wasn't good enough. We need to, PE and every subject really should be accessible for all, and especially sport and physical activity. There's something out there for everybody. She was from a low socioeconomic background. She couldn't do a forward roll. She couldn't do many normal tasks. Even doing her shoelaces up or getting ready was a challenge for her. And I thought, actually, in my class, I had my gymnasts that were going to the Wiltshire School of Gymnastics. The me before would have naturally got drawn towards that type of student. But actually, at that point, I thought, no, Zoe is the person that needs me. So she completely changed my mentality, and I thought, actually, my new mantra is I'm going to start off with who needs me most, and then teach to the top. And in doing so, it made me think about something that I learnt at university. So I'd gone back to something that I'd previously forgotten, which was this notion of physical literacy. And this is mainly what all of my work's in now. So it's about, in order to create people that are physically active for life, we say that they need the motivation, confidence, competence, and knowledge and understanding. And this helped me rebalance participation and performance, because sport, you can perform in and have your teams and elite teams, but also it's about participation. Everyone should be accessing sport and physical activity. So the first kind of key motor change then was that I was just in the flock, I was going with the flow, and Zoe encouraged me to actually say, stop. I need to put my head up and think, actually, is this where I want to be going? And as a result, we started to have more professional conversations in the department and wider network around, what is the value and purpose of physical education, and have we got it slightly wrong? Have we got the balance right? As a result, I thought, actually, more people need to start thinking like this. So that's when I made the jump into HE. Previous to this kind of work, it was very philosophical, very theoretical, not much translation into practice. I set about my PhD, which kind of was in 3 sections. One, theoretical and conceptual exploration. Next bit, professional development interventions. How can I go and change other people's practice? And then evaluate the impact of that professional development. Does it actually operationalise physical literacy? Are we doing anything different than we did before? So in that theoretical and conceptual exploration, I looked at, actually, one of the problems is that physical literacy and physical education is perceived at a very low status in a range of schools and contexts. So we know the pressure on numeracy and literacy at the primary stage, and then at the secondary stage, we've got real problems at year 11, it being taken off the timetable to focus on examinations. So actually, we need to elevate the value of physical activity, health and well-being. So how do we go about that? Next one was, how do we actually translate and embed physical literacy in practice? So what kind of translation piece needs to happen? Because it was very academic, and how do we translate that into teacher talk and teacher speak? And then how can I use a conceptual framework to help me do that job? So some of the work that we did was create a resource that people could use. It was around reflection, action research, what it is, what it looks like in practice, key top tips of how to incorporate it within practice as a resource. We also did things around the video. So this was something that I developed with the IPLA to help really communicate what physical literacy was, because the term confused a lot of people.
It's about first steps and active play. It's about being active with friends and family. It's about recreation and being outdoors. It's about learning and practice. It's about education, making progress, and a greater understanding. It's about fitness, challenge, competition, and the success it could lead to. It's about expression, performance, imagination, and culture. It's about enjoyment, every day and for life. This is physical literacy, the motivation, confidence, physical competence, knowledge and understanding to value and take responsibility for engagement in physical activities for life. Physical literacy, choosing physical activity for life.
So after we created that video, a lot of people actually thought, yeah, this does chime with me, and it is more than just physical education, but physical education does have a massive role to play in getting people onto the right track and also guiding what physical activity looks like in whole school. So getting children more active from the beginning, because we know that early childhood engagement predicts adulthood engagement in physical activity. So that was one of the pieces that we did to help with the translation. Another thing that's gone down really, really well is people didn't understand. Everyone says that the definition is so long-winded and quite a mouthful, but the reason it's a mouthful is because it provides the means to the ends. So we're saying that if you have all of those four elements, you're more likely to engage in physical activity. When you have an absence of one, so if it's motivation, you might be apathetic. If you have lack of confidence, you might experience anxiety. Lack of physical competence, you might get frustrated when you're not able to do what you want to do. And then finally, knowledge and understanding, you might get confused. We get this a lot around why people don't understand that they're making any improvements in their weight loss or physical activity engagement levels. They don't understand how much they should be doing and when. So by developing all four, we're more likely to engender physical activity behaviours. Also, if we can understand the barriers, we can then introduce interventions to overcome them. And we've created lots of interventions that capture this. And so we know that there is a correlation between those that self-report and high on those have higher levels of physical activity, and those that have self-report lower physical activity levels have lower levels of motivation, confidence, competence. So they're interdependent of one another. So another thing we did as well is look at how can we use this to kind of explain what the concept is. So we look at the definition as the tip of the iceberg. It's underpinned by domains, so the affective domain, physical domain, cognitive domain. But most importantly, the main body of the iceberg under the water is the philosophy that informs it. So it's based on these three key areas. Monism, which looks at the individual as a whole. So as educators, that chimes with us, developing the whole child, looking at an individual as a whole. Existentialism states that, kind of discusses that we are a product of our experiences, so trying to make sure we've got meaningful experiences that ultimately shape who we are. And then as a result of those experiences, phenomenology builds on from that, kind of saying that as a result of our experiences, we will all view the world differently. As a result of that theoretical exploration, I had another change moment. So I actually realised that I left teaching thinking I know what I'm doing. Got into academia or into my PhD and actually realised there's a loads to learn out there, so loads more questions and answers. So I kind of discovered lots of unknown unknowns. I didn't know that I didn't know this, and there were some things that I didn't know, the known unknowns, but there were other things that I didn't realise I hadn't incorporated or understood. So as a result, my content knowledge of what I should be teaching rocketed, my pedagogical knowledge of how I should approach my content rocketed, and finally, like, how could I adapt my teaching to suit the environment and the students rocketed as well. So I became a better teacher, even removing myself from the teaching environment, because I was better educated in all the strategies that I could employ, or not all, but more strategies I could employ. And so this kind of kicked off a transitioning period where I was starting to move from teacher to researcher, and I still grappled with confidence. You know, do I know enough? Who am I to go and tell somebody else how to change their practice? You know, I'm going to work with 14 teachers. Who am I to tell them that this is the right way? So again, continuing to grapple with, do I know enough? Have I read and considered it from as many different angles as possible? So that was kind of the first moment that actually I was quite confident when I left teaching, and then actually had a bit of a confidence crisis after learning, and especially with the philosophy. I got so deep in that I didn't know which way was up. I was contemplating the purpose of life at times, whether I should continue. More, you know, is physical literacy the only question I need to explore? So again, coming back from that, it kind of regrouping, discovering my confidence again was key. So then forged on to the professional development intervention. So it is a constructivist and interpretivist approach, qualitative methodology I employed, so lots of interviews and focus groups, and professional development. So the main methods were action research, where we watched lessons, we reflected together, and then they went off and planned. But alongside that, we had professional development. So every week they'd have a 1 hour, 50-minute lesson with me, learning new topics, content, and then they'd go and try and put that into their lessons. Teachers did anywhere between 10 cycles, so 10 lessons up to 14. So it was quite a long intervention with 14 teachers. There was a lot of data to transcribe. And then I analysed it through thematic analysis and narrative representation. So the research questions that I was kind of asking was, can professional development operationalise physical literacy? So is professional development alone going to be able to transition physical literacy from theory to practice? No worries. And then the second question was, how does the professional development actually improve their knowledge of the why, what and how of physical literacy? And then finally, what are the barriers? So what are the issues that we're coming up against in trying to get this into practice? So I had a pilot school in Luton that was from a inner city Luton, low socioeconomic background, majority of the pupils, high pupil premium. And I thought if I do my pilot there, I'll be able to test out some of the challenges that we're seeing. Then I had a second primary school in inner city Manchester, well, Greater Manchester. That was, again, this school was in a very deprived area. And then I had another school in Manchester, the secondary school where I did it. And then the reason why I did it again with another school in Bristol was because that Manchester school, the most experienced teacher had 4 years experience. So the head of PE was only 4 years into the job. So that was the participants. So overall we had 14 that we worked with, not including the pilot school. And this was the process. So we had an opening interview, so pre-intervention interview. We then had lots of action research cycles that went round, so depending on their timetables, how much they could do, if they were ill or off or whatever it was. So it was very me going into schools and working with what they had. So I know that a couple of them went off on a trip, so we didn't do it that 1 week, and so we carried on. So we had a number of action research cycles. Then we had a post-intervention questionnaire, interview again, and then we had a follow-up to see if any of that understanding had dropped. And as a result of all of that, we then also built a community of practice that they still use as a website that they go to and share resources. So there is an ongoing professional community of practice. So data was collected in a range of ways. So from the interview transcripts, from the professional development sessions themselves, from the lesson observations, the lesson reflections, the discourse transcripts, and just the field journal. Action research, we had our own lesson plans, and I had my own lesson reflection template that I used as well. So it was all geared around trying to develop motivation, confidence, competence, and knowledge and understanding, and create balanced lessons. We changed one teacher to say that it's not just about physical development. So in the PE world, sometimes we get a bit focused on skills, and actually that can be at the detriment of enjoyment or looking at the whole child. And actually they said we need to improve our department's vision around what physical activity and what PE is about. Another example was they've got a greater understanding of physical literacy, and they're able to self-reflect. So because of the action research and the reflection, they actually identified the areas of their practice they needed to develop, and they thought they had a more holistic delivery style. So this is where the next change kind of happened, is that in that intervention, it was much about me as it was about them. And the kind of insider-outsider dynamic is something I speak about quite a lot in my PhD. And that the reason it worked is because I had credibility, because I was an insider. I have been a PE teacher. I've been there. I've grappled with it as they had. So I had an authenticity to what I was saying, which helped me in the insider aspect. But the outsider aspect was that I was the independent researcher, able to zoom in and out. So what I actually realised is that I sat in between. So I operated in that space in between. And at times I dropped into PE teacher me, and at times I dropped into researcher me. A classic of teacher me was I had to stop a trampolining lesson because it was unsafe. So as a researcher, that's like a cardinal sin to jump in and stop. But the professional teacher in me couldn't allow that to continue. And then similarly, there were things that I could have coached with the teacher, and I had to keep that professional distance as a researcher and just let it happen and encourage them to reflect on it. So that constant knowing when to step in and when to step out was a real interesting bit about that. Credibility, I was fascinated with this. Looking back now, I was absolutely focused on this, about convincing my credibility, probably back to that confidence. So if you look at my slides of my professional development, I've got all these logos on there. I've got International Physical Literacy Association, the University of Bedfordshire, which is where my PhD's at, Liverpool John Moores University. I'm credible at them. And it's only when I've stopped and got out of the trenches and thought, actually, what was I trying to tell them? So I was trying to push my credibility all the time to them so that I could generate buy-in, so then I could get them to do what I asked them to do, which then leads to this next one around me being quite subversive. At times, I caught myself asking leading questions because I wanted them to almost, not brainwash them, but I wanted them to come around to my way of thinking. So just thinking and being self-reflective on not to be too subversive and trying to get them on my wavelength, but actually trying to get them to get there for themselves. This again led to this confidence crisis. You know, who am I to tell these guys what to do, and why do I have credibility? So again, this changed my practice. So I'm not going to go too much into the research findings, but lots of it is around accountability. So teachers have got so much on their plate that unless you hold them to account to it, they're going to forget or not necessarily prioritise it, and they need to buy into it. Other things they said is that we need more initiatives and funding. So PE teachers especially love to say that they haven't got the facilities, or they haven't got the funding to do it, or we don't have time to go on CPD. So they wanted more opportunities and funding to have a bit more of a creative curriculum. They also said that school subject leadership is a major issue, and they still feel it's really top down. So if your department head doesn't buy into it, or your school head, it's not going to really flourish because it's not a whole school approach. But this were the main issues, so it is around value of PE. So value of PE is probably at the lowest it's been for a long, long while, in that there's a big focus on examination, and if we are talking about value of PE, it's around GCSE PE, and the nature of the PE teacher has changed. We do probably a similar amount of marking. Government and Ofsted, you know, they're the ones that are driving the agenda, and often we feel like we have to dance to their tune. And then it just leads again, it's not a priority. So if we had an elevated status with more resources, we might be able to do this to better effect. They came up with some solutions though, because we know that teachers, me and self included, love to moan, but they're also really good at coming up with solutions. So increased awareness, increased opportunities, raise the importance and status of PE, and more professional development, especially at the primary sector. You know, we're still having 6 hours of PE input, if you're lucky, and then expecting them to be experts in it. It's terrifying, and I totally empathise with the primary generalist that it is terrifying to teach PE. Government policy, school policy, leadership support, and back to us, this is us now, university training, helping our trainees be more confident and competent in delivering physical education in its wider sense, making sure that we are balancing performance and participation and engendering a love of being physically active. My practice totally changed, and I've encouraged quite a few people to come with me. So I've probably got 14 or 15 teachers from that PhD that believe similarly to me. However, what was apparent was that's great, but we're not going to change everybody unless I can scale that up. And part of that scaling process is focusing on what's guiding the flock. So now I've got more questions than answers. So I've gone from a novice, not really knowing much about this area, to an expert around how can I get teachers to believe in physical literacy, teach differently. And now I'm back to square one thinking, okay, so I can change the flock, but ultimately what's driving the flock is the sheepdog or the farmer. How can I change Ofsted? How can I have a bigger impact on policy level, on the national curriculum? So I've had input onto the national curriculum for Wales, trying to raise the status and value of physical education. So we know that physical literacy professional development can change practice. Action research and the methods do work. Next, we need to refine it, scale it up, introduce sustainability and address the barriers. At the heart of all this work is existentialism. We are our experiences. We are our interactions with the world around us. That clouds how we view the world, and embodiment. So that means that we are knowledge incubators based on our experiences. Our past experiences guide our present and our future. Through critical instance, we can understand moments or hinge points for us to change our practice, thoughts and beliefs. Professionalisation process, we're part of that. How can we make sure that we are giving them the tools to think creatively? How can professional development help with those critical incidents and change practice? And then ultimately we're looking at behaviour change, trying to do something differently. I set out to make a difference and influence others, but I was not necessarily prepared for how those individuals and experiences would change me. And I think my PhD, as you'd hope, was probably it has been the biggest learning experience I've had, but not necessarily in the ways in which I had intended. So my question to you is, who is changing who, but actually who or what is changing you? So that is me in a nutshell.